Hello and welcome to this MedIQ Facebook Live event entitled Vaccine Update, Promises and Challenges. My name is Mark Hakam, and I'm Director of Risk Management and Patient Safety Education at MedIQ. We've got a great program and a lot to talk about, but first, let me introduce our guest for this session. Dr. Rishi Desai is a pediatric infectious disease physician with a public health background and currently serves as Chief Medical Officer for Osmosis. He previously spent 2 years at the CDC as an Epidemic Intelligence Service Officer. Dr. Roger Seheult is certified in internal medicine, pulmonary diseases, critical care, and sleep medicine, and is an associate clinical professor at the University of California. He is a co-founder of and instructor at MedCram, and previously served as medical director for several departments at Loma Linda University. We've invited Rishi and Roger here today for a frank and honest conversation focusing on vaccines for the COVID-19 virus. If you're joining us live, please post your comments and send us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them during our program. Rishi and Roger, thank you so much for being here. Rishi, please feel free to take it away.
Thanks a lot, Mark. I really appreciate that kind introduction. So Roger, I want to jump right in. There are a lot of folks that are going to be asking questions, and I want to get my questions in first because I'm in this privileged position to be able to chat next to you. Can you walk me through the key things that you find as reasons for optimism? Here we are in June, and a lot has happened in the last few months. What are some reasons that make you smile when you wake up in the morning with regards to COVID-19?
Well, Rishi, thanks again for interviewing, and thanks again, MedIQ, for having us on. So I remember in the early phases of this pandemic that they had uploaded within January, I believe it was, the entire genome of the coronavirus, of COVID-19, of SARS-CoV-2, if you actually want to say it that way. And so it was made public, and it was downloaded by just about every single biopharmaceutical company there is. And so with the technology that we have now, unlike ever before, we have people working on this at the speed of light. And we've got multiple companies working on probably over 100 different vaccines at this point. There's, of course, some that are far ahead of those, and we'll talk about those as we go through. But everybody is focused on this like a laser, and we're all using the best technology to get to the bottom of this. So there is a lot of room for optimism in terms of vaccine.
Have you ever seen this level of engagement? You mentioned over 100 different vaccine candidates in this short period of time in your history?
No, I've never seen this. Obviously, we know that the medications and pharmaceuticals to help in terms of making things better. But what has added even more pressure is a lot of people feel, and rightly so, that the way we're going to get back to any sense of normalcy is to be able to get the herd ratio or the amount of people infected up above 50 or 60%, or a much better way of doing it is to get people immunized. So really, this is the fast track to normalcy, and that's why there's so much pressure.
Can you walk folks through those two versions, herd immunity versus vaccination as a strategy? Do you see them as kind of two different strategies or part of the same strategy?
It's basically epidemiologically on the surface, it's the same strategy. You're basically, whenever the virus infects somebody, it's got to regenerate itself. And the only way you can do that is to jump out into somebody next to them. And if that can't happen, either A, because they've already had the infection and they've got some immunity, or number two, they've gotten a vaccination, then that R0, that's the number that we see how many people infect other people, is going to go to less than 1. And as soon as it goes to less than 1, we're on the track to beating this pandemic.
You know, in addition to the vaccines and the fact that we've never seen this before, the other piece that kind of excites me is the treatments and the fact that we've seen just unprecedented research in treatments. And we've been lucky this time around. Obviously, some of the antivirals have been used in other cases like Ebola, MERS and SARS in the past. And so we had a bit of a head start. The thing that I'm most interested in kind of observing closely is combination therapies, whether remdesivir plus lopinavir and ritonavir is better, or whether there's some other combination that might be interesting to kind of really take down both the virus, but also do it in a safe way. Have you seen something different on the treatment side as well, or are there other kind of moments or points of optimism that you've seen besides vaccines?
So that's a really good question. That whole idea about combination therapy hit home for me when I took care of a 19-year-old girl 19-year-old woman in our intensive care unit. Her mother had positive COVID. Her sister had positive COVID. And yet when she came in, she had bilateral ground glass opacifications, all of the same things that you would see: elevated ferritin, elevated CRP, elevated D-dimer. We tested her 3 times, Rishi, and every time it was negative. But we knew she had it. When we finally got the antibody test back, it was positive. So what does that mean? It means that her body had already cleared the virus at some point. And what she was doing was she was living with the post-inflammatory aspect of the virus. And that really hits home to me about what it is that we're doing. Yeah, the remdesivir knocks down the virus doesn't reproduce, you get the virus out of the body. But now you have to deal with the post-inflammatory effects of that. And that's where these other things, these other combination medications come in. The one that we're looking at and we're using, because we already have FDA approval to use it, maybe not FDA approval to use it, but it's at least available to us. And that's the IL-6 inhibitor, tocilizumab. So that's the combination that we're using, remdesivir and tocilizumab, if they meet certain criteria. And I think that's a great 1-2 punch. Number one, it takes out the virus at the beginning. And number two, it reduces the inflammatory effects of the viral infection.
IL-6 levels being high was something that the Chinese physicians were telling us to look for early on. They were saying, measure IL-6, see if it's elevated. That's a good indication of cytokine storm, which is a phrase that now I see even in the lay press, which is fascinating. But one thing that has shifted dramatically, and I recall you telling me this as well, is this idea of tropism. Like initially we thought it's kind of a respiratory disease, and now we're seeing much more of the endothelial effects or the vascular effects. That shifted, and we've learned a lot scientifically. To me, that's another huge source of optimism, is just how quickly we've learned this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've talked about a little bit on our website, BegCram, and it's a theory, it's a hypothesis, of course, but it's starting to bear out. The hypothesis is that the SARS-CoV-2 virus hits the ACE2 receptor, but it's more than just a receptor. It actually is a major balance pin to the ACE, the renin-angiotensin system. And destruction of that increases oxidative stress. Oxidative stress causes endothelial destruction, releases von Willebrand's factor, causes thrombosis. There was a great article in the New England Journal of Medicine about a week or two ago that actually showed histological slides of microthrombi in the alveoli arteriolar structure. And they compared it, they did a very good control on this. They compared it to influenza lungs and also control lungs. These were donated lungs that were not used in transplants. 9 times the amount of thrombosis in those patients that had COVID-19. And so certainly this may be what's going on. It certainly feels that way.
Yeah, and there's the L and H type that have been broken out, and this might be an explanation for what that is. Do you mind just sharing with our listeners what that dichotomy is?
Yeah, so the H is the high and the L is the low. H being high, not high compliance, but high elasticity. So high elasticity means that the lungs have a low compliance. These are the normal type of patients that you would see with ARDS, with influenza. What's different about COVID-19 is the L, the low elastance. These are the ones that have very compliant lungs. They come into the emergency room, they're extremely hypoxic, but they're, sipping on a drink, they're on their phone, and their saturation are in the 70s and 80s. So why is that the case? They're not becoming hypoxic because their alveoli are filled up with water and therefore restrictive. Is it possible that they could be hypoxic because the arterioles are being damaged, the vasculature? And I proposed a long time ago, I don't have access to this because I'm not at a big university center currently, but inert gas technique, multiple inert gas technique would answer that question. You get somebody with COVID-19 who's in this L type, and throw them into do it and see what percent is this shunt, what percent is VQ mismatch. And as they start to improve, it'd be nice to see which ones get better. But that's a nice scientific study.
So going back to vaccines then, can you talk a little bit about the vaccines that you're most closely watching? Which ones do you feel have the most promise? I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so the ones that I think have the most promise are the ones that I see got the cut. So there's a nice website out there that's a kind of a clearinghouse of all of these vaccines, and you can see exactly who the company is, how much money they've received, what the mechanism is. The top 5 vaccines, I think the ones to watch are, number one, the one from Moderna. That's in phase 2 right now. That's an mRNA virus, or mRNA vaccine, I should say. COVID-19 is a RNA virus. This is one that really stands out by itself. Moderna has never really brought a vaccine to market, and yet it's really jumping far. There's a couple of interesting issues about that. We can talk about that later. Number 2 is Oxford Astrazeneca. So this is another one of the out of the top 5 in the United States that they're looking at. This is the only one that's actually manufactured outside the United States. It's made in Great Britain. Those are probably the top 2. The rounding out the third one is Johnson & Johnson. Of course, a huge perennial favorite in terms of vaccines. They've done a lot of that. Of those 3 companies, Rishi, they've already received $2.2 billion in funding, and there's much more funding ready to go. The government is betting big on these top 3. To round out the top 5, we've got Merck and Pfizer. They also have their own vaccines. Some of these are antigens, some of these are traditional, some of these are DNA, et cetera. But those are the top 5, I think, to watch.
So now, flipping it around, what are some of the challenges? We talked about reasons for optimism, but what are some reasons to be cautious in the coming weeks and months with regard to vaccine?
So if you're about to run the 100-yard dash, or the 100-meter dash, I guess they call it now, you're going to want to know, what's the world record, right? How fast have we ever gotten a vaccine successfully to market? And the record is 4 years. So that's the record, okay? Of course, that wasn't during a pandemic and the whole world wasn't focused on it, but that's kind of what we're looking at, is 4 years. Obviously, that's not acceptable. We need the politicians and people are expecting a vaccine by the end of the year, or by, worst, early 2021. So what has to happen is you have to have a vaccine. You've got to develop it in the lab. Then you've got to test it in animals, generally speaking. And then you go through 3 phases. So what are those 3 phases? Phase 1, 2, and 3. Phase 1 is where you test the safety of that in human beings. Okay, so there's past animal studies already, and then you go into human beings and you do it. And it's usually maybe less than 100 people that you try this on. You look for side effects, you try to square that out. Phase 2 is where you're looking at dosing. So how much of this do we need to give? And that you're talking maybe about a couple hundred subjects. When you finally figured out the safety, the dosing, now you're ready for what they call pivotal trials. These are the phase 3 trials that get published in the New England Journal of Medicine, in the Lancet. These are big trials. These are the things that lead to FDA approval and labeling. And then you can have, at that point, a vaccine. But it's not like you just go down to the local store and get a vaccine, right? You've got to actually have factories ready to make these vaccines. And so that's why they're trying to move a lot of this stuff in series, in parallel. They're betting on which one is actually going to have something that's going to pass this, and they're getting the infrastructure ready now so they can start mass producing it.
And one thing that I recently came to learn about and have read quite a bit about now is human challenge studies to contract the phase 3 part of these trials. And the idea of human challenge studies is, of course, and on the face of it sounds almost crazy or unethical, which is that you're literally giving the virus to people that are volunteers that have been vaccinated to see how well the vaccine works. And you might say, well, how could you do that? I mean, we're talking about how dangerous this virus is and social distancing so you don't get the virus. Why would you turn around and give it? Can you talk a little bit about the ethics of human challenge studies from your perspective?
Yeah, you've actually just basically did it right there. But basically, in a pandemic situation, out of all the situations, a pandemic situation is where you would think that this is the least opportunity. I mean, this is where you don't have to worry about getting the virus, or worry about people not getting the virus. So you could just vaccinate them and see. But remember what the overall incidence here is, right? Even in a place like Los Angeles or New York City, far less than 25%. I mean, in Los Angeles, according to the antibody study, we're about 5% of the people. So if that means that you would have to vaccinate 20 times more people to find out. And when you're talking about these very expensive trials, that might be a situation. Yeah, 5% versus 0.0005% is a big difference, but practically speaking, maybe not enough. And so the ethical trials of giving somebody a virus that is potentially deadly, that is certainly an ethical thing. And typically, Rishi, as you know, the people that sign up for these things usually get paid. and the people that usually get paid are the ones where money is an issue for them. And so you're selecting out a group of people that are financially maybe more in need and maybe more willing to do this sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely right. And the other factor that I always like to point out with human challenge studies is generally you're trying to mitigate risks. So you're going to pick a healthier, younger, non-comorbid illness type person. And the people that are dying of the disease are quite the opposite, right? They're the elderly with comorbid disease. So you have to wonder whether the inclusion and exclusion criteria of this human challenge study is really going to make this externally valid when you go out and try to use it in the real world. I also think that there are certain groups like healthcare workers that are probably closely watching vaccine because they're going to be obviously a prioritized group, and they're, you know, like yourself and like me, to get the vaccine early versus someone else that may be at lower risk. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out in the U.S. I'm also curious to get your thoughts geopolitically at an international level. Like it's one thing for the U.S. to get the vaccine. What are your thoughts on a country that may not have the same means, a low-income country that may not have capabilities of buying a vaccine? What is their chance of getting the vaccine?
Well, you're absolutely right, and it's not even low-income countries. Like, let's talk about Canada. During the swine flu, they didn't have a flu vaccine, so they asked the United States at the time if they could get theirs, and they said, "Sure, we'll make an agreement that you can get the swine." They never got it because the United States wanted to make sure that all 300,000 of their people got the vaccine before they shipped it off to Canada. Of course, they didn't need it by the time that it was ready. So this is a real issue. It's really those countries that have the manufacturing that are going to get the vaccine, and not those that don't. And so it's a real issue. And so you have to have probably entities that oversee countries. So we're talking about WHO, we're talking about United Nations, those sorts of things, so that there's equitable ability for people to get the vaccine. One more thing though on the ethics. And I don't know if we'll get into this later, but probably one of the one that we're looking at the most right now, that mRNA virus made by Moderna. The FDA actually gave that company the ability to skip, I would just say skip, but to do human testing phase 1 and animal testing simultaneously. So it's not like they went from animal testing and then they jumped into both kind of in parallel. I thought that was pretty interesting. One of the articles I was reading on that, and I don't know if anyone has this, but we haven't seen the consent form for that phase 1. It'd be interesting to know how well that's laid out in that consent. So you're right. There's a lot of ethical issues.
Yeah, and as you well know, a lot of people will look at a consent form glossy-eyed and then look right at you and say, "So can I sign this?" And oftentimes people will say, "Sure, it's fine." There's just a lot of legalese in there. Rarely do people spend a lot of time going through those consent forms, and it's unclear how many people actually fully understand them. With that in mind, Roger, you obviously have a much deeper understanding than I would say the average citizen. I'm sure you would agree there. So look into the future with me a little bit. What is your sense on best case and most likely case scenarios in the coming weeks and months?
Yeah, so we've got about 5 different companies that are bringing a product to market. If we look at, for instance, the Johnson & Johnson one, so that's, I mean, they're perennial favorites here in terms of they've done this before. They're not looking to start phase 1 trials until September of this year. And so if you look at that, I would say we're going to probably be most likely we're going to be deep into 2021 before we have a non-healthcare provider getting vaccines. And that's probably going to be next summer in my estimation. However, if things go absolutely perfectly, if the ones that are in the front runners right now, like Moderna and the Oxford Astrazeneca, if they're by a miracle, the ones that they've chosen to say this is the black stallion of all of the vaccines, and everything goes great, then it's possible that we could be in early 2021 or even at the end of this year. I think it's a best case scenario. It's possible that our black stallion may turn into a dark horse.
That's a very eloquent way of putting it. So I guess maybe a final question before we jump into general questions, but what should people be listening to for right now in terms of like, what are the right sources of information versus what is the news kind of hyping up in your mind?
Yeah, so the right kind of information is going to be looking at the phase 2 trials, phase 1, phase 2, and then of course phase 3. Once you're in phase 3, normally in a phase 3 trial for a medication, there's a panel that's going to sit down, they're going to discuss it, they're going to put it on the shelf, they're going to if a phase 3 trial comes out, we're going to see something very similar to remdesivir. Something is good, it's stopped early, there's immediate approval, and hopefully by that point, they've already got the factory up and running. So once you hear, I think in this situation, Rishi, once you hear that a phase 3 trial is nearing completion, a vaccine, if it's a good phase 3 trial, a vaccine is literally weeks away.
Got it. And it's interesting also because North America is obviously going to go through an election in November. And so this falls in the very middle of this kind of execution and logistics. And it'll be interesting to see if that affects the timeline in any meaningful way as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So we do have some questions coming in I'd like to share with you. I think this first one's for Roger. There's an ongoing study looking at recombinant ACE2 and how it may act as a decoy for the virus to bind to while providing some of the vascular benefits you've discussed in some of your MedCram updates. Any thoughts on this approach?
Oh, I think it's a outstanding approach. They have actually looked at this for SARS-1 because it had the same receptor at that time. I haven't seen any data on that. I don't know if they have an interim look at that data to see if it works, but you can imagine it would make sense. If you've got a bunch of soluble recombinant ACE2 floating around, it's going to be hard for the virus to tell which is which, and hopefully prevent you from getting the infection. I think it's an excellent idea.
Okay. Here's another question. How do we deal with such a sizable portion of the US not taking things seriously?
Well, Rishi, I'll talk and then you will. We say this all the time in medicine: education, education, education. But people, just like nutritious food, people would rather have candy bars and ice cream. I know my kids would.
Yeah, I also think that there's an interesting tipping point that you see in a lot of conversations. You saw this with climate change. People didn't take it seriously. And then there was a bit of a tipping point. And now to hear people talk about climate science, it's palpably different than, let's say, 10 years ago. Another thing is, here we are June 4th. We're in the middle, at least in North America and many parts of the world, having a discussion around race relations. And that's having a tipping point. I think that there's a public education campaign that Roger's getting to. And I think when you have enough sort of different people, different voices coming to the table saying kind of the same thing, you do get a public tipping point. And I hope the same is true with COVID-19.
Okay. Another question, does secretory IgA, mucosal IgA antibodies play a role since COVID entry seems to be mucosally based?
It's possible that it would. I know that IgA is involved, interestingly, in some of the Kawasaki stuff, I believe. And so it may be playing a role. Also, IgA, interestingly, is one of the immunoglobulins that's secreted in breast milk. So that's a question there, is if the mother is infected, does she pass along passive immunity to the infant if they're breastfeeding? As far as I know, based on the latest check that I did on the CDC website, it appears as though they have not yet detected the virus either in amniotic fluid or in breast milk. But Rishi, that's kind of your area.
Yeah, so you're right. The CDC, it's kind of interesting in terms of going back to the source of information. The CDC does say that exact thing, that what you just said, Roger. But ACOG puts out guidelines, and the ACOG guidelines, they've talked about how there are actually a handful of studies that they've looked at, small trials, where they correctly, just as you said, haven't found the virus in amniotic fluid or breast milk, but they have identified a breastfeeding mother that passed along IgA to the baby for SARS-CoV-2. So I think it is relevant, and it's a great question, and we're seeing evidence, at least there, certainly evidence in other coronaviruses as well, SARS and MERS, of secretory IgA being part of breast milk.
Another question, isn't it true that you are only given a low dose of the disease in these studies?
So I assume what you mean by that is a low dose of the disease. Normally in a vaccine, it's either augmented or attenuated, and then so it can't cause the disease. That's more in the traditional sense of a vaccine, like a polio vaccine. What we're talking about here, this is so revolutionary different, especially the Moderna vaccine. We're talking about an RNA strand that gets put in, it infects the cell, then tells the cell to make the protein, and then you have the protein made, and then you have an immune response against it. It doesn't have the same, it doesn't have the proteins. It's basically the RNA, and it makes a portion of the protein. So you're actually not even getting an infection in the general sense. Rishi, do you have any other comment?
I think your take on it was that the vaccine is what they're referring to. I wonder if they're talking about the human challenge studies and the viral inoculum you get when you're being exposed. And in that situation, you're getting a dose that they calibrate to be the infectious dose. So they wouldn't give you a dose that's smaller than the dose that's thought to cause infections. And they actually test that out with serial titration to make sure that they're giving you a dose that's going to cause infection.
Okay, thank you. Would you describe what would happen if one injects COVID-2 virus in a subject intravenously? Will progression of COVID-19 happen sooner and more severely?
Well, I would say that you probably would get more vascular manifestations, since that's the first ACE2 receptors that you're going to see. I think the theory is that you come down with respiratory illnesses because that in that particular person is what it hit. Whereas some people do get GI symptoms. Maybe they swallowed it and it affected the ACE2 receptor in the GI tract. I would imagine if it was injected, it'd be very unlikely for it to happen. I guess people have brought up the possibility of mosquitoes transmitting this from person to person. I think that's probably very unlikely. We wouldn't know, but it'd be very interesting to see. Maybe those are the people that have strokes. I don't know. It's possible.
Also, once you get viremic, that virus tends to like to go everywhere. So it's also possible you get injected with it and then it kind of goes retrograde in a sense into your lungs and causes respiratory disease there too.
Okay. Do you have a sense for how long immunity from a vaccine would last versus natural immunity from having gotten the virus and having recovered?
Well, I would say that it probably depends on the virus. Like we've got certain vaccines like MMR, once you give it, you're pretty good. And then you've got other quote vaccines, not really vaccines, but we've got the flu, right? The flu changes just about every year, and we always have to get the newest vaccine. So coronavirus is a cold virus. And how many times have we had the cold? Multiple times. And it's because there's so many different versions and varieties of it. We know that that COVID-19 is mutating. You can see it mutating on the computer. There's nice websites that actually show the different strands. Wow. So I would, my estimation, what I'm preparing myself mentally for is just like every year we get an H1N1 flare up and we see a pretty severe case of the flu. I would imagine that COVID-19 is going to be somewhere in there, and we're all going to remember back to this time when it first came out, and we'll probably see a little bit of it every year.
So this question is for Dr. Seheult. Do you have an opinion on extraneous ingredients in vaccines? Should each of the 5 prospective vaccines be restricted to delivery in organic oils only?
Yeah, so there's a whole closet industry, I guess, out there and trying to figure out which one has the preservative, which one doesn't have the preservative. Little confession here, I'm always getting the single dose mercury-free influenza injection. Why? It's because my wife tells me that that's the one that I have to get because she's the one that reads all of these things. So, I do it. I don't know. I don't know. I think we have to look at the risks and the benefits of everything that we do. And if we want to get as many people vaccinated as possible, I think it's going to behoove us to put it into a vaccine that the most amount of people are going to want to take. In other words, let's be a stepping stone rather than a stumbling block.
Sure. My question is around the BCG vaccine and its role in decreasing the number of infected people as compared to people in countries that have not been giving the BCG vaccine.
You want me to take that, Rishi? I'll start. I'll take it first. We'll see how it goes. So this is interesting. The studies that they've looked at, there was a study that was done out of in Texas, and it showed that they looked at this epidemiologically, and exactly what your questioner said is that patients in countries that had the BCG vaccine had almost 10 times less mortality than those that didn't have the BCG vaccine. So let's talk about which countries those are. The United States doesn't have it. Italy, interestingly, doesn't have it. They had a very bad outbreak. The problem is that this is an associative or retrospective study. So it's very difficult to say that a BCG vaccine is going to give you that kind of immunity. That being said, the WHO, interestingly, looked at this a number of years ago, and their theory is that, well, they gave the BCG vaccine, but when we gave the BCG vaccine, a lot of other things got better in addition to just tuberculosis meningitis, which is really the purpose of the BCG vaccine. They thought that they saw a lot of other diseases go down. And so what they believe may be happening is, yes, the BCG vaccine is strengthening the adaptive immune system. That's the T cells, the B cells, all of these antigens. But there may be a bleed over to the innate immune system, the macrophages, the natural killer cells. And if that's the case, those are exactly the type of cells that you want activated if you're dealing with a virus. The virus, these cells go around and just eat up bad things and then present them to the adaptive. So I think it's a little too early right now to say for sure that the BCG vaccine causes an improvement in your immune system that reduces it. Let's say it's associated with it. And there's ongoing studies right now to see whether or not this in fact is the truth.
Yeah, there's a beautiful study. So the WHO, just as you said, saw all-cause mortality go down, not just TB-associated mortality. And TB mortality was a trifle part of that all-cause, so it really created a lot of wonder. And when you look at yellow fever virus, that's given in the context of BCG. BCG was protective. And so we have already seen now in another virus, it was protective. So the thought is that maybe here as well, and there are RCTs out there right now looking at this exact thing.
It's hard to believe our time is up. Rishi and Roger, thank you so much for joining us today. That's all the time we have right now. If we didn't get to your questions during the program, fear not. Rishi and Roger have agreed to review the questions, and we'll post their comments on our Facebook page shortly. Also, please comment and tell us what other COVID-19 related topics are most important to you so we can address them in future events. Make sure you follow MedIQ on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram to hear about our offerings in clinical medicine, risk management, and patient education, available in a variety of formats, including more COVID-19 related content coming your way soon. We want to thank you for joining us. Keep washing your hands and be safe.